First of all, we are delighted to be here and join what we think is a really important conversation. One of the things that, could you go to the next slide, I've learned from my spouse is that one can talk about things without really knowing what they're talking about. So when I go through these key findings, which I will in a moment, I'm going to try to tie them to some of the things that we believe you're working on and to be provocative in the process. So again, if I've misinterpreted some of what you're working on, my apologies. Here's what we'd like to cover. Steve's going to talk about a little bit about our journey, how we got here to writing this book, researching and writing this book. Then we're going to both go through some of the key findings that our research generated. And then we were going to turn this back at you to ask the question, how do these findings impact, jive with, or not the things that you've been discussing? So very briefly, and we'll go through this in more detail, 5 key findings from our perspective. Number 1, we need to think much more expansively about how we define skills in the workforce development system. So that means, I think, as you're looking at the employee skilling life cycle, we believe there are a lot of things that may come first and well before occupational training for a considerable percentage of workers who are either on the margins or new to the workforce. Number 2 is that while programs may focus on different industries, there are certain common lessons across programs that perform and generate results and impact for the people that go through them. Third sort of key finding is that unless we adopt skills as our medium of exchange, we will continue to penalize some workers at the expense of the system overall. Fourth finding is it is time to rethink how we define scale. Fundamentally, scaling more of program X will not get us where we need to be, but scaling more of program X or funding more of program X working with employer Y will get us where we need to be. And then the final finding is we believe it is both possible and necessary to rewrite conventional narratives about opportunity and about partisanship. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Steve to talk about the process, how we got ourselves to this point.
Yeah, thanks. And let's go to the next slide too. So just really quickly, we began before COVID with an inquiry from the Smith Richardson Foundation. I'd written a book a century ago on how cities could be better off. It was coming out of a period where cities appeared to be pretty pathological. And then 15 years later, pre-COVID, it looked like at least large cities were on a roll. People were moving into their downtowns. Things looked great, except not so much, right? Because there was this issue of inequity and success had not been even. One way to think about this, then we set out to figure out how we could close the gap that we've called on this slide, the two-sided economy, just really quickly. The right side of this slide is Indianapolis, not when I was mayor, but sometime later. And on the left part of the right side of the slide is all the cool stuff happening in Indianapolis. Great place for young professionals, a livable downtown, top 10 place to start a business, all seems really quite good. And on the right side is the these things are happening as well. 6th most economically segregated region, 20% of the manufacturing base lost in the last decade. And actually, I think that 20%, Kate, is 80% increase in people in poverty in the decade that preceded the time we did this slide. So this was pre-COVID and alarming. So we set out to, Kate's got a nonprofit background. Kate's got a much more liberal background. I've got a government background. So we went about trying to talk to workers and nonprofit leaders and city leaders and private company leaders to see what were a set of best practices that could address this. Next slide, please. And so as we did that, and you all know this, I mean, we're talking a particularly expert group today, right? We've got, whether you call it a reshuffle, a resignation, a demographic bomb, a hollowing out, you know, we're in this kind of weird circumstance where we've got millions of open positions and millions of people either not working, not in the workforce, or earning less than they need to survive. So we have this misalignment everywhere, and our research set out to kind of what set of policies could turn this into an opportunity for people who don't have it today. Next slide.
And I think there was a quote on that slide that really summarizes how we feel about this, which is, it doesn't have to be this way. We actually know what to do. The question is having the will to do it. So before we talk about our findings, I just want to say a few more words about our approach. So through our network, because our goal, as Steve said, was to identify programs and policies that work. So through our various networks, which were fairly extensive, we identified hundreds of programs. From those programs, we looked only at ones that had some sort of third-party evaluation. Now, candidly, it didn't have to be super sophisticated. It didn't have to be a randomized control trial, but some sort of external look at the impact the organization was making. We narrowed the group down, and then we spoke to executive directors, program staff, program participants. From those conversations, we developed 10 principles for what we say will to architect a more effective and equitable workforce development system. The first two relate to the people that the system is designed to serve. That is to say, how do we get more people into the pipeline? The second four relate to the characteristics of high-performing programs. That is to say, the science of getting people through the pipeline. And then the final set of four principles relate to the system overall. In other words, how do we scale this across regional areas? If you can go to the next slide, please. And I'm not going to go through each of the principles. I'm going to do this in the context of the findings that I shared earlier. So the first kind of finding is that we need to think much more expansively about how we define skills and how we define the players within the system. If you go to the next slide, because by any count, and you guys know this, there are millions of people that are either outside or at the margins of the workforce development of the economy, whether we're talking about opportunity use, or justice involved, or people who are unemployed or underemployed. So that universe has to be part of our consideration. So the first thing that we need to understand, if we want to get more people into the pipeline, is what are the in-demand skills? And Steve's going to talk about this in a region, the in-demand projected and current skill gaps that exist in the region. But really importantly, if you think about the people that we're talking about here on this slide, for many of them, the journey to a good job does not begin with occupational skilling. It may begin with executive skill functioning or career readiness skilling. So if you go to the next slide, there's an organization that we talk about in the book called ROCA. ROCA deals with justice-involved youth. They use cognitive behavioral therapy to improve executive skill functioning. Well, you need executive skill functioning if you're even going to participate in a training program, much less complete it. And we know from brain science that stress, whether it's caused by scarcity or violence or COVID, adversely impacts one's executive skill functioning. So ROCA uses the cognitive behavioral therapy, as I mentioned, to help people develop executive skills. An organization called New Moms here in Chicago make executive skill coaching an integral part both of their interactions with individuals and part of their transitional employment training. Organizations like ROCA and New Mom, we believe, constitute feeder organizations into the workforce development system and therefore are a critical part of it, which means when we think expansively about human potential and how to define skills, we also need to think expansively about the organizations that are part of the system and with whom more conventional occupational trainers can partner. If you go to the next slide. I just want to, this is kind of a parenthetical, but it's one thing to understand needed skills in a particular system, in a particular region. It is quite another thing to get people to participate in the opportunities that exist in that region for skilling and education. And this may be the CMO in me talking, as I have been numerous times in different organizations, but we need to also understand, and I would think to some extent this influences some of your work, what is it that drives someone to take the step of engaging in education and training? And we know from research, and this is a tiny bit dated, that many people, more people think a good job is out of their reach than think a good job is within their reach. It's a slight, it's not huge differential, but still 50% is a big percentage. In order to take action, people need to believe, number one, that training and education will lead to better financial circumstances and that they can overcome the barriers that get in the way of participating in training. So those barriers are, financial barriers, work-life balance, all of those kinds of things. Finally, if we're really going to push them to the next step, then they need information that allows them to evaluate options. And some of the things that are important are flexibility and stackability, and of course, financial support for taking action. So that's another piece of it when we think about getting people into the pipeline. We can go to the next slide, trying to speed this up. The second set of findings relate to the characteristics of high-performing programs. Can you go to the next slide? Thank you. So as I mentioned, we looked at lots of different programs, addressing different population, training for different sectors. All of them share certain common elements, and I'm not going to go into all of these in detail, just want to focus on a couple of them. All of them, to the extent possible, personalize their interventions. Now, sometimes that's application criteria, sometimes that's upfront assessment, but what that allows them to do is determine whether someone is ready to participate in training or education. And if they are not, to figure out what needs to be in place to get them ready, whether it's logistical support or educational support. All of them, to point number 2, provide access to or direct wraparound services and coaching. And I know that somewhere in when I read some of the materials that you've been thinking about, you've put supports kind of in a separate area. I think you call it family supports, in a separate work stream. We believe that supports are critical within the training and development work stream, our perspective. Contextualization, I'm going to talk about in a minute. And then all of them provide bridges to employment, which I know you're addressing through apprenticeship, internships, sectoral initiatives, and even employer-based scenario work, project work. You can go to the next slide. I just want to say a couple of words about contextualization. As you know, many people lack certain adult basic education skills, whether it's reading or math or English as a second language or a GED. Some of the most effective programs that we looked at combined adult basic education or ESL with occupational training, because the reality is If someone's forced to sit through an ABE class or an ESL class before they can take occupational training, that delay in getting to a salary or a better salary is a demotivator and will cause some people to fall away. One of my sort of favorite examples of this is an organization called JVS. They actually, and they teach English as a second language. They actually build the modules around interview questions. So very powerful example of contextualization. Community colleges do this as well. And I'll talk about that a minute later. So now I'm going to turn it over to Stephen to talk about the system overall.
You're muted, Steve.
To confess, I'm recovering from, I hope I'm recovering from COVID. I still have it. So I'm trying to mute you between coughs and then turn it on at the opposite time. So I apologize. So these two principles, utilizing skills and the collaboration, cause us to rethink notions of scaling. So let's look at the next slide, please. Your group represents the best of all of these things. So I don't want to drag you through them too much, but let me just step back and say, you know, we did in the research, we were involved in a project with UNCF and the mayor of Atlanta, some of the HBCUs down there, the Chamber of Commerce and the like, and tried to look at skill-based hiring and who was getting hired and who wasn't. And even in places enlightened as the greater Atlanta area, the inequities were pretty pronounced. As we think about a skill-based system, though, we have a number of relatively serious problems. One is that not too many regions use real-time data to identify skill clusters, right, and translate skills from resumes and job postings in a way that creates a usable marketplace. We'll come back to that. There is insufficient attention often to the skill gaps, those gaps that need to be resolved in a community in order to help people have upward mobility. Third, and I know you all feel this, but what is the nomenclature in a region for skills, right? In other words, if a person has this set of skills and wants to take a training program to augment their skills, how do you name that? And so how do you name it in a way that allows an employer to understand the stackability of those skills? And you can't, even if you have a nomenclature, it's very difficult to do that without a personal skill record, right? Much of your work deals with the role of employers. And, you know, we've been arguing, as all of you have, that employers need to do more skill-based hiring and less exclusively rely on degrees. That's all well and good unless you're the HR director and you can't figure out what skill sets the aspiring worker really has. So you need a standardized nomenclature, personalized skill record, transparency for reasons we'll talk about in a minute, and how that leads to equity. So these things together would produce a skill-based system. Even in the highest performing regions, there are lots of holes in putting together a system that uses skills as the currency. Next slide, please. Kate, is this you or me? Me. Okay. So I think there are a couple ways to think about this, and particularly as it relates to equity. You know, we featured in the book IBM in part because IBM has eliminated degree as a requirement for 50% of its North American jobs. It uses a personalized page for employees to identify their skills. It recommends to them classes or certifications they can take. It's as you would expect from IBM, a pretty sophisticated process. The question then becomes for smaller employers, how does the region then put together the pieces that IBM is doing internally? What would that look like at the regional level? And we referenced there the UNCF Atlanta work that we did before. But a system based on degrees is insufficient and inequitable, right? We have the historic discrimination that the higher education system has embedded in itself. We have the barriers to opportunity that come with that. And so how can we identify skills, encourage people to take the step that Kate mentioned, and then verify that they have those skills for hiring purposes? That system will produce more equity. Next slide. And as this is pretty basic to the work you all do, so but I thought it was important to mention it nevertheless. Whether you're the navigator or career coach, or you're the worker, how do you know that if I take X course, there's a 90% likelihood that my salary will change in this amount at the end of that course, right? Without transparency about skill-based learning and training, how does a worker make a decision? So Kate in the earlier slide said 50% of workers don't believe that there's a step they can take that will lead to a better outcome. In part, that's because it's accurate because of the barriers that are in front of them. And also, in part, it's accurate because they're not seeing real information. We tell the story in the book. Between us, we have 6 adult children. They have 4 spouses among so that's 10 adults. At any single month, 1 or 2 of them is looking for another job. And because collectively between Kate and myself, we have lots of degrees, they'll call and say, hey, Mom, hey, Dad, hey, Kate, hey, Steve, what do you think I could do to get this job? We Google it, but we don't really have any idea whether this certification, this college degree will actually lead to a better job. So transparency, and this is just a very simple thing I clipped out of a Wall Street Journal article a few years ago. This is a nurse's aide trying to decide whether it's worth investing in nursing school and what happens at the end of the nursing school. We need this sort of clarity for the navigators and counselors, as well as the individuals. But even the training alone is insufficient without the collaboration necessary for the wraparound skills. Next slide. And the region, we view this as a regional problem. And there aren't too many regions that bring all of the pieces together. We were impressed with Houston. We were impressed with San Diego. There are obviously other places as well. But for example, in Houston and in San Diego, the collaboration was organized by the business community here, the Greater Houston Partnership, which created Upskill Houston. But it wasn't, even though it was originated by the business community, the critical nonprofits and educational organizations and wraparound service organizations were at the table. And they were identifying the gaps in the system. They were using data to do that. And, you know, we don't want to take too much of your time, but I mean, I went down and observed this Houston partnership. And it really was interesting. Take the Sanjac, which is one of the country's leading community colleges, right? And the president of Sanjac was saying, you know, well, the local employers came over. I think these were oil and gas employers, and said, you know, the way you're teaching math is not related to the math we need at the work site. And the electrical contractor came over, and these are all in this conversation, and said, you know, the way the K-12 schools are featuring the construction jobs means we have more work than we have workers, and we can't get workers because you're not expressing how much a person can earn who does works as an electrician, or their path to get there. And they helped actually build the classrooms that look like the work sites. They helped translate the materials in ways that were relevant to the point of Kate's contextualized learning. So we feature Houston here because it's collaborative, it uses data, it identifies the gaps, and it identifies ways to get more people into the pipeline. Next one. Am I still talking, Kate? Since we're married, we want to make sure that we each have exactly 50% of the time that we're speaking. I want to really care. This may be my last slide. So this is just a way to think about this, right? What does that data infrastructure look like? Well, we think a trusted intermediary needs to be in the center. And one of the problems we have that I think you all can address is that there's no elected official who's the natural convener of this organization. Mayors, and there are lots of mayors in a region, but even the mayor of the largest city spends more time on economic development than they do workforce. The workforce boards are federal, state, regional organizations doing their best, but with lots of restrictions and not a lot of high profile authority. So in the region, you've got all of these pieces. They need to have a data platform that informs them about gaps and promises and hope. And this schematic is what we saw happening in San Diego, for example, and in Houston, a data infrastructure that promotes outcomes and advances equity. Next slide. I say this cautiously since I'm a former elected official, but I believe that the elected officials in most of these regions need to rethink their role with respect to workforce development. So how do they help identify the flaws in the system? This is a situation where real authority is too limited. So apparent authority should be exercised. And as we look at this, who calls people together in the region? Who calls the foundations and the employers together? It should be the elected officials. Who helps advocate for equity and the outcomes? And what authority does, what tools and levers can an elected official utilize that produces this collaboration? Well, they have voice, they have rhetoric, right? They can tell stories with maps and visualizations about the Atlanta stories were quite visual in how folks of color were huddled down at the bottom of the job opportunity and how the top part was so disproportionately, white, where they can highlight successes and failures. They can convene parties together. They can use their appointing authority or their contracting authority. So this slide is just to say, everybody needs to collaborate, but let's lift up the role of the elected officials. They don't need to and probably shouldn't run the intermediary that acts as the collaborative hub, but they ought to make sure that everybody's working together and present with that intermediary. Next slide. Okay, Kate.
Want to give this one to me? I was giving it to you, darling. Steve talked about Houston, so those are regions writ large, but the whole notion of partnering to get more people into the pipeline and through the pipeline can also be what I would call much smaller, but equally as effective for those individuals. So Cook Medical produces medical devices. They have plants all around the world. They have open positions everywhere in the world except in Indianapolis, where they partner with Goodwill. 60% of their employees there are just as involved, and they have a waiting list of some 100 employees, which is not insignificant relative to the entire staff there. What they do with Goodwill is Goodwill actually does the recruiting, the hiring, the managing, and the wraparound supports to the population. Cook provides the facility and the technical training, and between them, they are able to fill all of the open positions in that plant, and it has been to date very successful. So this is a small example, but if you think about it, it's an example of how one scales through partnerships. And if you go to the next slide, one of the things that we advocate is really rethinking our notions of how you scale. So it is not investing in more and more Goodwill programs in a Goodwill store or more and more ROCAs in Baltimore or in Massachusetts. It's investing in partnerships that bring together a Goodwill and a Cook Medical or a ROCA and any number of the employers that they work with. Now, there are other ways to scale too, which is to take those attributes of successful programs and instead of scaling the program, scale the attributes into existing programs. And I think they're pedagogical lessons as you think through even employers. What are employers borrowing from some of the lessons that successful organizations have to teach us? We can also utilize networks. One of the very interesting things that we found is that some of the highest performing organizations had created networks of like organizations and then aggressively share their IP with those organizations. Another tool for scaling is actually to think creatively about how you integrate some of the lessons and characteristics of high-performing programs into large infrastructures. So for instance, there's a program it's still in its demonstration phase called My Goals. It integrates executive skills coaching into subsidized housing. This is, I think, in Baltimore in Texas, subsidized housing or in public housing as a part of helping move the people who are in those facilities, in those housings to better jobs. And then the other thing is, listen, we get asked the question, are we optimistic? And the answer is we are, because we think the dialogue is reaching a fevered pitch about the importance of skills-based hiring and equity. And we see things like the Good Jobs Challenge, which I'm sure you all know about, maybe even have had Todd, I don't know if he came and spoke to you about it, but there is a lot to learn from the winners, but also a lot of opportunity to work with the people who were not awarded grants, but who have thought through the process with many of the elements of successful programs. So go to the last slide, please. Here's the other thing, which we think is absolutely necessary. So Steve mentioned, I am a very far left of center Democrat. He is, and I'll caveat this, an old school Republican. So politics is a constant source of conversation in our household. In this research, we did not once disagree about the policy recommendations, not once. We disagreed about language, what that language might signal to someone, but never about the policy, which suggests to us what we're talking about is a nonpartisan issue, and how we convey that is critically important to moving us forward. Steve, you wanted to add some other things to this as well?
Well, I mean, inherent in what convergence does, and maybe to conclude, Kate's mentioned a couple times, we think this is a half full moment. You know, I was mayor at a time when the number of people looking for work dramatically exceeded the number of jobs available, right? So now that we have almost the flip side, that looks to us as an opportunity. And another way to think about that opportunity is on this issue of narrative. So the narrative comes together as well, right? So individuals in neighborhoods that have been neglected over time, or who have educational issues or the like, the individuals in those neighborhoods deserve an opportunity, right? They deserve an opportunity for their families, they deserve an opportunity economically, and more so. Yet also, if we think about folks who live in suburbs and never actually see or deal with somebody in poverty, who may have kind of false stereotypes, now's a chance to change that, because you know, I can't remember, Kate, what the number was, but just the loss of gross regional product in the Indianapolis region as a result of underskilling was like $4 billion. In other words, if we're going to have flourishing economic opportunity in those regions, then we need to give people the opportunity to develop their human potential. So we believe there's this opportunity for narrative that says it's in the region's best interest, regardless of where you are on the economic scale. Let's bring folks together and actually develop the potential that's necessary. So that's a history of our research. It's not anything probably striking to a group as experienced as this, but we think there are very few places that have all the pieces that come together. Thanks for your time.